Imagine being a talented teenager with a future that seems almost guaranteed. You're a gifted basketball player. You have loyal friends, a mother who cares about you, and dreams of becoming a star. Then, little by little, everything begins falling apart. That is the story of the Basketball Diaries, the 1995 drama starring Leonardo DiCaprio as Jim Carroll. The film follows a promising young basketball player whose life spirals into heroin addiction, crime, homelessness, and eventually prison. It is based on Jim Carroll's autobiographical writing about his teenage years in New York. At the beginning, Jim's life revolves around basketball. He spends most of his time with his closest friends, Pedro, Mickey, and Neutron. They're young, reckless, and constantly looking for their next adventure. On the basketball court, however, Jim is different. He's talented, focused, and good enough to believe that basketball could eventually take him somewhere. But Jim is also a writer. He keeps a diary and turns the confusion of teenage life into poetry, describing his friendships, fears, ambitions, and the strange world around him. His best friend Bobby is one of the most important people in his life. But Bobby is seriously ill with leukemia. Jim visits him in the hospital, trying to bring some excitement into his friend's final days. Their friendship gives Jim a connection to something deeper than basketball and street life. Then Bobby dies. For Jim, the loss is devastating. He suddenly has to confront something that teenagers aren't supposed to understand yet, the possibility that someone you love can simply disappear from your life forever. After Bobby's funeral, Jim and his friends return to the basketball court. They talk about Bobby, they joke, they argue, but underneath everything, Jim is struggling with grief. And this is where his life begins changing. Jim and his friends have already experimented with different substances, treating drugs as another part of their reckless teenage lifestyle. But after Bobby's death, Jim's experimentation becomes something much more dangerous. He discovers heroin. At first, the drug feels like an escape from everything. The sadness disappears, the guilt disappears, the fear disappears. For a short time, Jim feels like he has found a way to shut out the pain. But heroin doesn't solve his problems. It simply makes the problems harder to see. Soon, basketball begins losing its importance. Jim's behavior becomes increasingly unpredictable. Even his relationship with his coach, Swifty, becomes disturbing when the coach makes an inappropriate sexual proposition toward Jim. Jim refuses and lashes out, further damaging his relationship with the team. Then drugs begin affecting Jim's performance. Before an important game, Jim and his friends take pills they believe will help them. Instead, the drugs leave them barely able to function on the court. Jim's basketball career begins collapsing. The sport that once represented his future is disappearing from his life. And Jim doesn't seem to care anymore. When his mother discovers his drug use, she confronts him. She sees what her son is becoming. Jim sees only another person trying to control him. Their argument becomes explosive. Eventually, his mother throws him out of the house. Now Jim has nowhere to go. The basketball player who once dreamed of becoming a star is suddenly living on the streets of New York. And without a home, his addiction becomes even more dangerous. Jim, Mickey, and Pedro stop thinking about the future. They think only about their next high. To get money, they steal. They take increasingly dangerous risks. And every decision pushes them further away from the lives they once had. One failed robbery leaves Pedro arrested. Jim and Mickey escape, but their situation continues getting worse. The streets that once seemed exciting now become a prison. Winter arrives. Jim's addiction has reached a terrifying level. One day, he collapses in the snow after taking heroin. He's barely conscious. His body is freezing. He should probably die there. But someone finds him. His name is Reggie. Reggie is an older neighborhood friend who understands addiction because he's lived through it himself. Instead of giving Jim what he wants, Reggie takes him home. He forces Jim to face withdrawal. For Jim, it's torture. His body demands heroin. He screams. He begs. He promises anything for another dose. But Reggie refuses to give in. For the first time, Jim experiences what it means to fight his addiction instead of feeding it. And for a brief moment, it seems like he might actually escape. But escaping heroin isn't as simple as surviving withdrawal. Even after Jim gets clean, the life he left behind is still waiting for him. His old friends are struggling. His mother is disappointed and exhausted. The streets are still dangerous. And Jim has almost nothing left of the future he once imagined. Without basketball, school, or a stable home, he begins drifting through New York again. He tries to rebuild his life, but addiction has already changed the way he thinks. The memories of heroin keep coming back. The temptation is always there. And eventually, Jim relapses. This time, the consequences are even worse. Jim and Mickey return to stealing and dealing drugs to survive. Their friendship becomes increasingly destructive because both of them are trapped in the same cycle. They need money for drugs. They need drugs to escape their problems. And they need to commit crimes to get the money. There seems to be no way out. Jim's mother eventually finds him again and tries to help. But Jim's addiction has reached a point where promises mean almost nothing. He wants to change, but wanting to change and actually changing are two completely different things. One night, Jim and Mickey decide to rob a house. What begins as another desperate attempt to get money quickly turns violent. The police arrive. Jim is arrested. The dream of becoming a basketball player is completely gone. The teenager who once imagined playing professionally is now sitting inside a prison cell. For Jim, prison becomes the lowest point of his life. But it also forces him to confront what he's become. He remembers Bobby. He remembers basketball. He remembers his mother. He remembers the friends who disappeared along the way. And most importantly, he remembers the person he used to be. The boy who wrote poems. The boy who loved basketball. The boy who believed his life could become something meaningful. That person isn't completely gone. Jim begins writing again. Instead of using drugs to escape his emotions, he starts putting those emotions onto paper. His experiences become stories. His pain becomes poetry. And slowly, writing gives him something drugs never could. A reason to keep going. The film's final moments make it clear that Jim's story isn't about magically fixing everything. Addiction doesn't disappear because someone decides to stop using. The damage doesn't disappear because the drugs are gone. But recovery begins when Jim finally understands that he has to take responsibility for the life he still has. The boy who once thought basketball was his only future discovers another way to express himself. Through writing, through memory, through honesty. And that's what makes the Basketball Diaries so powerful. The movie isn't simply warning us that drugs are dangerous. It's showing how quickly a promising life can change when grief, addiction, peer pressure, and desperation begin feeding each other. Jim doesn't become addicted overnight. There isn't one single moment that destroys his life. It happens gradually, one decision, one experiment, one escape, one more dose, until eventually, the person he wanted to become seems completely out of reach. But the story also refuses to say that a person is permanently defined by their worst years. Jim survives. He keeps writing, and the experiences that nearly destroyed him eventually become the foundation of his creative life. The real tragedy isn't that Jim was never talented. It's that he had so much potential and came dangerously close to losing all of it. And the real victory isn't simply that he survives addiction. It's that he finds a reason to live beyond it. Because sometimes the hardest part of recovery isn't escaping the darkness. It's discovering who you are when the darkness is finally gone. There is one final part of Jim's journey that makes the story even more powerful. After everything he has lost, Jim eventually begins to understand that his addiction was never just about drugs. It was also about escape. He was trying to escape grief after Bobby's death. He was trying to escape the pressure of growing up. He was trying to escape the disappointment of losing basketball. And eventually, he was trying to escape himself. Heroin gave him that escape for a while. But it also took almost everything from him. His friendships, his family, his future, his freedom, and almost his life. What makes Jim's story different is that he eventually turns those experiences into something meaningful. The diary he once used to record teenage adventures becomes a way to confront the darkest parts of his past. Instead of hiding from what happened, he writes about it. He writes about the streets. He writes about drugs. He writes about friendship and loss. And he writes about the version of himself that nearly disappeared. That transformation becomes the real ending of the story. Jim doesn't get back the years he lost. He can't bring Bobby back. He can't undo the crimes he committed. He can't erase the pain his addiction caused his mother. But he can decide what happens next. And that decision is what separates recovery from simply surviving. The final message of the Basketball Diaries is therefore surprisingly hopeful. A person's worst mistake doesn't necessarily have to become their entire identity. Jim's life could have ended on the streets. It could have ended with an overdose. It could have ended in prison. But instead, he survives long enough to tell the story. And that story eventually becomes the very thing that gives his life meaning. The teenager who once dreamed of becoming a basketball star discovers another way to make his voice heard. He becomes a writer. The pain that once destroyed him becomes material for his art. And the diary that began as a private record of teenage life becomes a testimony about addiction, survival, and redemption. That's what makes the ending so important. Jim doesn't simply escape heroin. He learns to live without needing to escape himself. And in the end, the Basketball Diaries isn't really about basketball. It's about how quickly a young person's life can change. And how difficult, but still possible, it is to find your way back. Jim's story ultimately comes full circle. At the beginning, he is a teenager who believes he has his whole life ahead of him. He has talent, friends, dreams, and a family that still believes in him. By the middle of the story, almost all of that has disappeared. But the most important thing he loses is his ability to imagine a future. Addiction makes every day about the next few hours. Where will the money come from? Where will the drugs come from? How can he avoid withdrawal? How can he escape the consequences of what he has done? There is no long-term plan anymore. Only survival. That is why his recovery is so difficult. Getting clean doesn't instantly make his life better. Instead, it forces him to experience everything he had been running away from. The grief, the loneliness, the guilt, the memories. For the first time, Jim has to feel all of it without drugs. And that is where writing becomes so important. His diary gives him a place where he can be completely honest. He doesn't have to pretend that he's strong. He doesn't have to pretend that his friends are okay. He doesn't have to pretend that addiction hasn't destroyed parts of his life. He can simply tell the truth. And slowly, that honesty becomes a form of healing. The movie also leaves us with an important reminder about friendship. Jim and his friends begin the story as inseparable teenagers. They believe nothing can ever break them apart. But addiction changes those relationships. People who once protected each other begin stealing from each other. Trust disappears. Everyone becomes focused on their own survival. It's a painful demonstration of how addiction can affect not only the person using drugs, but everyone around them. And yet, there are still moments of compassion. Jim's mother doesn't completely give up on him. Reggie refuses to let him destroy himself. Those moments matter because they show that recovery often begins when someone is willing to believe there is still a person underneath the addiction. By the end, Jim finally understands that he can't change his past. But he can choose what to do with it. His experiences become part of his writing. His writing becomes his voice. And his voice becomes a way to warn others about the road he almost never escaped. The boy who once wanted to become a basketball star eventually finds another way to leave his mark. Not on a basketball court, but on the page. And that is where the Basketball Diaries ultimately leaves us. Not with a perfect ending. Not with every problem magically solved. But with hope. Because Jim's story proves that even when someone falls incredibly far, the possibility of getting back up can still remain. Sometimes survival isn't about returning to the person you were before. Sometimes it's about becoming someone stronger because you survived what almost destroyed you. And Jim's diary becomes the proof that his story didn't end in the streets. It continued. He survived long enough to tell it. Years later, the story of Jim Carroll would become much bigger than the streets where it began. The diary he kept as a teenager became the foundation for his memoir, allowing people to see addiction not as something distant or abstract, but as something that can slowly take control of an ordinary young person's life. That's what makes the ending of the Basketball Diaries so memorable. Jim doesn't win because he becomes famous. He doesn't win because his past disappears. He wins because he survives long enough to make a different choice. The basketball court that once represented his future is replaced by something else. A blank page. Every experience he went through becomes part of his story. Every friend he lost. Every mistake he made. Every night on the streets. Every moment when he thought there was no way back. He puts all of it into words. And perhaps that's the final lesson of Jim's journey. Your life can change direction without warning. A dream can disappear. A friendship can end. One bad decision can lead to another, and another, until you barely recognize yourself. But as long as you're still alive, the story isn't necessarily finished. Jim's journey began with a teenager who wanted to become a basketball player. It continued through addiction, crime, homelessness, and prison. And it eventually became the story of a man who found a different way to survive. Not by pretending the past never happened, but by facing it, by writing about it, and by refusing to let the worst chapter become the final chapter. That is why the Basketball Diaries remains such a powerful and disturbing story. It isn't simply about drugs. It isn't simply about basketball. It's about losing yourself, and finding a reason to become yourself again. And in the end, Jim's greatest achievement isn't making it back onto the basketball court. It's making it back to his own life.